Our guest this week is Magistrate Anne Barker, discussing accountability, justice and forgiveness. Welcome again to the English Hour on ANN Satellite Television. Our guest today is Anne Barker. Anne is an Anglo-American like myself, but in Anne's case, she's American-born, I'm British-born. So it's an honor to have Anne with us, especially Anne is actually a Justice of the Peace, and this is a first for ANN Television. Part of the British judicial system. And we'll be discussing three subjects with Anne. The first is the judiciary, the judicial system in the United Kingdom. The second is the issue of accountability, and more about that in a moment. And the third is the whole concept of forgiveness. So three very seminal issues for us on ANN Television. Britain has a judicial system in which all criminal cases start in magistrates' courts, and over 97% of them end there too. Only the most serious crimes go to Crown Court. Magistrates' courts are presided over by a bench of 3 justices of the peace who dispense summary justice. Britain has the highest rate of imprisonment in Europe, with a total prison population of over 86,000 people. However, when compared to the United States, this number is comparatively low. One of the reasons for which is the American 3-strike system, which leads to lifetime imprisonment. In ethics and governance, accountability involves answerability, blameworthiness, liability, and an expectation of account giving. The aim of the prison service is to enable offenders to face themselves, admit what they have done, and tackle the problems which led them into custody. Accepting them helps them accept themselves, and this is the beginning of rehabilitation and effective preparation for release. Anne, thank you for being our guest today.
Pleasure.
It really is great to have you with us. We should actually start by explaining to our listeners, you're a Justice of the Peace, which is, I wouldn't say it's a uniquely British idea, but the British judicial system.
It is.
It is
in the United States, there is such a person as the Justice of the Peace, but a Justice of the Peace in the United States has one function, and that is to marry people.
All right.
So if you say JP in the United States, they think you're marrying Sam.
Yes.
They don't realize that you have any role in the judicial system.
Yes.
Now, the British system is, I think it's unique. It's unusual, if not unique. In the Magistrates' Court, all criminal prosecutions begin, and 97% of criminal cases are both tried and sentenced in the Magistrates' Court. So only 3% go up to the Crown Court. So we're a high-volume business.
Right.
And my bench, which is Westminster, is the oldest in the land. It's 13th century, and it's also the busiest in the land, which perhaps shouldn't be too surprising.
Now you're dealing almost exclusively with criminal cases.
Only criminals.
Right.
It's criminal
and
court.
the difference between you and Crown Court as a basic rule of thumb is that at Crown Court they would have a jury system?
They have a jury system, and that's important. They're the only part of the hierarchy with juries. Magistrates sit 3 of us together. The Crown Court has a judge and a jury. The Court of Appeal, the 3 justices of appeal sit as a threesome, and the Supreme Court sits at least 3, sometimes 5. So the only sole players are the Crown Court. The rest of us sit in groups.
Now explain to us so we understand. The jury system, which is uniquely British.
No.
Not you, of course no. Of course
William,
America and half the world.
Yes, quite.
Yeah, but much of the Middle East may not have a jury system.
Okay, fair enough.
So let's just explain that in a British context. The jury system.
I can explain it quite easily. There are some offences which are only triable in the magistrate's court. And there are some which are either way offenses, and the magistrate's court has to decide if they are going to be tried in the magistrate's court or referred up to the Crown Court. And that is based on if our sentencing powers are great enough, or if it's likely to attract a long sentence, it goes up to the Crown Court.
Mm-hmm. Now, and what is, just to understand again, the Crown Court system, what is a jury system?
A jury system is a judge and a jury of 12.
So 12 ordinary people?
Yes.
And who are chosen pretty much at random?
Yes.
And then they would decide whether the person was guilty or not guilty.
Yes.
As opposed, you're a justice of the peace.
Mm-hmm. I'm a magistrate.
And as a magistrate, then you've been appointed, and you will sit on a sort of tribunal with one of three.
Well, it's not a tribunal, it's a court.
It's a court with two other magistrates.
That's right.
And by consensus, you will decide,
yes,
between the three of you,
yes,
what sentence is dealt out with.
Well, if there's a conviction in the first case,
yes,
and if there's a conviction, then go on to sentence.
Right, right.
But you have to have an agreement. It's collective responsibility. If it's 2 against 1, then that's just the way it is.
Right. Okay. So interesting. So this is the situation. You're dealing with criminal cases. Everybody is presumed innocent until they're
absolutely
found guilty, and you're dealing yourself with very often what you might call minor criminal cases.
No,
but
we deal with everything. If I tell you last week, it's a good example. In one afternoon, it was taking pleas as to if a person was going to plead guilty or not, or if it was a serious case, what we were going to do with it. And a man who had been shoplifting and gone into Harrods and nicked things to the tune of several £100s, we dealt with. The man who followed him was part of a £5.5 million drug scam. We did keep him inside until he could be produced to the Crown Court. The likelihood of him going on a walkabout was rather high. So we decided that he would be remanded in custody rather than in the community.
And then you sent him on to the Crown Court with
yes.
the jury system for
yes.
trial.
Yes.
And that's entirely your decision. But if you keep somebody in your court, then you don't have the access to the higher powers of sentencing beyond 6 months. Is that right? Or?
No, we go up to, you can have 2 consecutive 1-year terms, so we can go up to 2 years.
Oh, right. Okay. Okay. Interesting. So you would often deal with violent crime as well?
Absolutely. Often.
Yeah. Interesting. And in our criminal justice system, I mean, you regarded as effective. You're a believer, as they say, in the British criminal justice system?
I am, and one of the reasons I am is it's fair, and being an American and British, I can take pot shots at both sides. This is one of the things that the British do extremely well and Americans do extremely badly, frankly, inside criminal justice, or criminal justice full stop. We look at a crime and we look at the evidence. If somebody is convicted, fine. When we go to sentence, you're looking at 2 things. You're looking at the offense, but you're looking at the offender as well. So that if, take the man who had done some shoplifting, if this was his first offense, and if the amount were comparatively low, he might get a conditional discharge, which is saying, right, you've been convicted. If you don't do anything for the next year or 18 months, it'll go away. If you do, then it will become far worse for you on the next go. But you'd be looking at a fine or a low-level community order. When you start ratcheting up to custody, you really have to take the person very much into account. If it's somebody who has pages of previous convictions, you're going to be giving that person a much higher sentence than somebody who is lightly convicted. So it's both the offense itself and their sentencing guidelines, but it's also the offender. And it's different from the United States, which about 40 years ago went on to a kind of points-based system. And I remember there was an article in the Atlantic Monthly from some high court judges in the United States saying, you don't need judges anymore. All you need is a computer. And skipping ahead a bit, but when I became the senior member of the parole board here, I went on to the mainland in Florida to see, where we had a house in the summer, the head of the Florida Parole Commission. And I thought, well, this is going to be interesting. Am I going to learn anything? I have to say, I was dumbfounded when he greeted me with these huge piles of computer printouts. And they had down to the hour how long each prisoner had been behind bars and at what earliest point he could be turfed back out into the street. It was a good sign of how different the system is.
Interesting. So nothing's arbitrary in America, even the issuing of parole. It's decided. Well,
It is arbitrary. We're not arbitrary. They are.
I see. So the arbitrary in the sense that it's a point-based system and it's automatic.
And ours, there's nothing automatic about our system.
Right.
Down to the point that one of the things you will know living in central London, that we have more than anybody else in the country, is crime tourists, people who come in order to steal. And we have been able to secure in our sentencing guidelines an exemption so that if you come in as a crime tourist and you're part of an organized group, you're convicted, the starting point is 18 weeks in custody, which is stiff.
Which is more severe. So the whole system, and we don't have the American thing. I mean, just talking, since we're talking about differences with the American, some U.S. states have a strange system which is quite frightening in a way, of 3 strikes and you're out.
That is federal.
That's federal.
That's federal, and that's what's producing such a skewing of the whole system in the United States. 3 strikes and you're out relates to drug offenses. If you're convicted and sentenced for 3 successive drug supplying crimes, you go in for life. That's it. No parole. You go in on the 3rd. And what's happened as a consequence of that is that American prisons are huge, but violent offenders are being let out because there isn't a room for everyone, and the drug offenders have to stay inside. That is a seriously dangerous system.
Yet, in Britain, we have, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, we have very high levels of imprisonment compared to the rest of Europe.
We do. We have the highest rate in Europe. We've got 147 per 100,000 here. In Germany, it's 63. So we lock up many more people than anywhere else in Europe. We pale by comparison, however, to the United States, which locks up 782 for every 100,000.
Good Lord, really? How remarkable. So, I mean, why are the United States are locking up people to that degree? Because of their point-based system?
I think there's an appetite for custody, which we have more of than the rest of Europe, but the United States has an even greater one than we do.
Interesting.
But it's also, I think part of it is the points-based business. It takes discretion. That's the problem. You eliminate discretion when you're doing things that way. And our whole system is at discretion within certain boundaries.
And why does Britain have a higher rate of imprisonment than the rest of Europe? Is that down to people like yourself, or is it the judiciary, or is it the politicians?
It's a combination of things, part of it, but not all of it. The Europeans like to tell us that they have more community sentences than we do. And that is true to a degree, but also not true to a degree. I think that our system has evolved in putting more people behind bars for offenses than theirs. Some of them, it's very interesting. Sweden's is low, and I remember going to a conference years ago, and there was a Swedish judge, and he had been looking at Jutland And they don't even put murderers in custody there because it's a small enough community and people know each other. So it's the community itself which makes sure that this person doesn't do anything wrong again. So it's a very stable community, small. Everybody knows everybody. And if you kill my husband, everybody knows it, but you're going to, watch me very, very carefully indeed and make sure that I don't do anything else.
How extraordinary! This is just a small region, Jutland.
It's a small region, but in areas where there is less mobility and far more stable communities, you can operate a system of non-custodial sentences much more easily.
So they get sentences, but they're non-custodial. So they'll get community sentences.
Yes.
Now, what is the difference between a community, just again, because I think it may be of interest to our listeners to understand how British judicial system works. What's the difference between restorative justice and community? It is the same thing, or
No,
not?
it's not at all.
Well,
No. A community sentence is a sentence of the court. It will be imposed. If you have a drug problem, an alcohol problem, an anger management problem, a community sentence will be imposed, and the probation service will come up with a report, and they'll say you have to do this program, that program, report to your probation officer, go through the causes of why you're committing crimes. So it's very offense-focused, trying to reduce the risk of reoffending. Restorative justice operates completely outside the formal legal system. It was first developed by Thames Constabulary, actually, in the early 90s, as a way of putting an offender and a victim together so that they could both understand each other. And it helped both sides. But from a crime standpoint, if you have actually had to sit down and talk with the lady whose house you've burgled, you're less likely to do it in the future because the consequences of your actions have been brought home to you so clearly.
So can restorative justice, is it ever part of the judicial system?
No.
No.
It's informal and outside. It's very good, but it's informal and outside.
Now, I suppose, I was caught speeding in my car, and I was given the alternative, instead of being given a fine and points on my license, which is the system we have here, whereby if you get so many points, your license is removed from you.
Yep, do it all the time.
Yes. Well, exactly.
Disqualify all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and that's from, yourself or people like you. And instead of I was offered the alternative of going on a speed awareness course, where they, and I took that alternative, and then I was shown the error of my ways in so many, because they then told us about children and accidents, and the greater likelihood of killing a child if you were driving at 30 as opposed to 20, and so on. And it was quite dramatic as to how the impact of speed on the potential death of a child and so on. So it was reinforced very strongly the need not to drive too fast.
I would have thought a hefty fine might also have been a reinforcement.
No, I don't think so. Not in the same way.
Didn't you? But you had
I was
to pay a
fined
fine
before. I've been fined. I'm sorry, it's not my first offence. I'm ashamed to say.
Am I surprised?
Yes. And whereas the fine didn't affect me. I think
the course did. Oh, good.
Yeah, yes.
Good. That's good to know.
But is that restorative justice?
No.
That's not.
No.
That's a kind of community sentencing. What is it? It's none of the above.
None of the above. It's it can. That's interesting. We used to be able to impose a driver awareness course on someone. This was quite a few years ago, as in addition to disqualification. But you could reduce the period of disqualification if you, in fact, took the course. That's no longer possible. It's fascinating. I haven't thought about that in a very long time.
Oh, interesting. So,
So it's offered by the police is the point, not the court.
And there is, there could be a kind of restorative justice as an alternative to a charge. That's been done, I think, experimentally. But for minor offences, the police have offered community service instead of it being charged.
No,
not something
they can't do that. No, they cannot give. The police cannot give you community service.
Right. So so under our system, restorative justice is not something that you hand out. Or
That's right.
Right, and so it's almost an altruistic act on the part of the criminal to engage in restorative justice. Or,
You mean because he isn't being forced to do so?
Yeah.
Well, I would have thought so in the first instance. Yes.
And do you do much community service? You issue much?
Well, I'll tell you what I think is interesting and extremely good. I have no idea how anybody's going to pay for it. But as of last month, everyone who gets a custodial sentence, even 2 weeks, is going to have 12 months probation supervision afterwards. Now that is a long time within which the probation service can work with someone to go through the problems which had led the person to commit crimes. It is absolutely wonderful. It is going to be so expensive. I have, as I say, no idea how anybody's going to pay for it, but it's a wonderful idea because what's been available so far is that for sentences under 4 years, you're released at the halfway point, and you're on license then for the other half, and in that time, you can work on programs of different sorts in the community with probation, and in the best of all possible worlds, that's what's happened. This is life, so it doesn't always happen, but in the best of the possible worlds it does. But what's interesting in this is that if you had somebody who was jailed for 4 months, there would not be any kind of post-release supervision or work. And now, as of last month, everybody's going to get it.
Interesting.
And I look forward to seeing the results of this.
And what about one of the other experiments in America that's taken place is zero tolerance policing, that is, whereby every offence gets taken to the magistrates. Has that been experimented to the court?
Well,
have we experimented with that here at all?
Zero tolerance, as I understand it, doesn't have to do with the courts. It has to do with the police, and it has to do with no tolerance of violent crimes and drug offenses, and taking a ruthless attitude in regard to investigating them and bringing them to court. And that's why New York became so much safer than central London did at one point, which I must say used to appall me, because I used to say, your pocketbook isn't safe here, but your life is. And to have New York become safer than London was really quite an abrupt
It's a remarkable transition, because I remember New York when, as I was a young man, it was quite a downtown Manhattan, could be quite a dangerous place late at night. Whereas now you wouldn't hesitate to walk around. It is a remarkable change. Interesting. So, well, that's given our listeners a feeling for the British judicial system, which hopefully is exemplary. What about the second issue on our agenda for today?
Yes.
The issue of accountability, really. And this is actually very important, I think, for many of our listeners, because we have seen attempts at accountability. Bahrain had, after the troubles that went through in the Arab Spring, it had the Biki report, which was an attempt at making the Bahrain establishment more accountable, the police, the judiciary, and so on. And an independent commission was brought in and did some very good work. And then much of the questioning now from the opposition is the degree to which the Biki recommendations have been implemented. So we have people in the Middle East do fully understand the idea, the concept of accountability. And you've been engaged in a number of ways in this work. Most clearly, particularly with the police force.
Indeed.
Serving on, just tell us about it.
The Police Complaints Authority.
Which has, and there are all sorts of controversies about the complaint system, but by and large, you would say it was effective.
Yes, I mean, I never thought that I was going to become the queen of complaints, but given the fact I'm the one who's made decisions, considered and made decisions about complaints against the police, immigration officers, doctors and barristers, I have a fairly good understanding of the terrain of complaint. And it sounds like something, a complaint. How could this actually make public institutions accountable? And the answer is that it can, because it's identifying what is going wrong with the systems and procedures and what needs to be fixed. So that when I joined the Police Complaints Authority, the morale of the police was low and the respect for the police was also low. And the Police Complaints Authority had been set up to increase morale on both sides by ensuring that the police actually didn't misbehave. And there was a broad swathe of complaints. There was some that were considered on the papers. I was responsible for all of Met Southeast from Lambeth Bridge to Croydon. That is a grass swathe of areas through Brixton of people who have made allegations, sometimes quite correctly, that the police have discriminated against them.
There's all of Southeast London.
Yep.
Yep. Yes.
My workload was 25% higher than everybody else's because they generated so many. And some of these went into boxes. They went on for weeks. And I was simply doing it on the papers. Some of the others, we were all responsible for police forces and supervising. If the police killed or injured someone or committed malfeasance in public office, we had to go in, take over, get the local force out, bring another force in, and direct the investigation. When I joined this, my son said, "Oh, good, Mom, you get to be Morse now."
Yes,
and,
yes.
And I had, within the first month, I had 6 major incidents rooms with 36 officers in each. And that was only in Northumbria. That wasn't with my other forces as well. But what we were doing was making sure that if the police had acted in a way in which somebody had died, for instance, that the actions could be justified in any way, to make clear what had happened, to decide if criminal charges should be brought, and to hold the officers to account.
And that happened. Officers were
absolutely
held to account,
yeah.
And because people often are concerned that there's a leniency with the police force when it misbehaves, but you felt that the Police Complaints Authority was functioning effectively.
Yes, I've had quite a few arguments with quite a few chief constables, as indeed did my fellow members. And they have been held to account. I mean, there was one, I remember, when I joined the Home Secretariat, asked that there be a reinvestigation of a murder. A man had already been convicted of murder, but it had come out that it looked as if some of the witnesses had perjured themselves. So I had to open up a whole new investigation. And at the end of all of this, it was true that some had perjured themselves. They found themselves going to trial, being convicted, and all of them ended up in prison.
And these were police officers?
No, these were witnesses to what had happened.
Oh, right. So these are witnesses.
Yeah.
Yeah. But
the police officers lost their jobs.
They did?
Yep.
Oh, well. So it's encouraging and it's necessary, and we need accountability. I mean, you're a member of the judiciary. Is there a similar process for the judiciary? I mean, in the sense, I mean,
What,
are
if we
you
misbehave?
Are you subject to accountability in this?
Absolutely. You could complain about me to the Lord Chancellor's department, and I would be held accountable.
Mm-hmm. And
everybody has to be in public life.
Yes. And you'd be held accountable by an ombudsman. Or by
I'd be accountable to the Lord Chancellor.
Right, Right. Who is in our system now? The Lord Chancellor is an elected, as opposed to appointed, but appointed by as a Minister of the Crown.
That's right.
From our parliamentary system.
That's right.
But he is the. Correct me if I'm wrong. He is the only publicly elected figure that is in our judicial system. In other words, there's nobody else.
No.
And the Lord Chancellor is Minister of Justice.
That's no, those are separate.
Those are separate.
Yeah.
Okay.
We have a Minister of Justice who is the head person in the Ministry of Justice. The Lord Chancellor is different.
Okay. I should know these things.
No reason why you should.
Anyway, interesting. So the I'm just going off at a sidetrack, but just because it is in the news currently, and some of our listeners may be aware of it, there is a move to pull Britain out of the Human Rights Court. We have, of course, the Supreme Court in any case. So cases of human rights can be taken to the Supreme Court within the British system. But there is a move, well, there's actually a move to take Britain out of Europe, but that's a separate issue. There's a move to take Britain out of the the European Human Rights Court, which I think, I may be wrong about this, but my impression is that the present government is quite committed to doing that.
It's very sensible, I have to say.
Really?
Yes, because when we didn't have a Supreme Court, when the highest court in the land was the Court of Appeal, it made sense to go, like the rest of Europe, to the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg to consider human rights complaints. And we did that. Now that we have a Supreme Court, we have our, as you've said, we have our own jurisdiction now for considering these matters in Britain. We don't have to go to Strasbourg anymore. That's the point. It's a jurisdiction issue.
So you are in favour
I
of
am.
Britain moving out of the European system of...
The European Court of Human Rights, to the court, yes.
Yeah.
We don't need it. We've got our own.
Interesting. Immigration, that's also subject to oversight in some way, and you've been
Or to
engaged...
scrutiny, yes.
And
I chaired a committee which for 3.5 years audited immigration. It was the 3.5 most head-banging years of my life. As we all know, immigration is inefficient. The way complaints help is they were identifying things that were going wrong. They were identifying problems with passports. They were making clear there were problems in queues. The whole processing, the whole points that weren't working in the process were being made clear by complaints. And on the basis of analyzing the complaints, we could make recommendations to ministers, the Home Secretary, and then on the back of that, legislation could be planned for Parliament. There was one area of it that I held to be supremely important, and that was complaints inside the detention estate. When we started, we discovered that allegations of very serious injuries were being categorized as rudeness. And when we looked behind it, it was appalling because there were very, very serious assaults going on in the detention estate, and they weren't being processed at all. So
assaults by
immigration officers on detainees. I was determined that we were going to have set up a small team of independent investigators who were completely outside line management, who were not responsible to anybody inside immigration, who would investigate these allegations and make sure that the perpetrators were held to account. I have to say that it worked as long as I was there, and my suspicion is that it probably stopped shortly thereafter.
I mean, we have an extraordinary situation here where we've got immigration detention centres like Yarlswood that take families.
Yes.
And so this is of quite considerable concern. Well, they're called immigration removal centres, aren't they? Or Yarlswood is an immigration removal centre, and it's there's a lot,
I've been there.
problems.
There have been problems at Yarlswood. Yarlswood isn't as bad as some, though.
Interesting.
And and part of it, forgive me, but part of it is of the most concerning was going over to Calais and Coquelles and having these vans going along the road with Kent police on the side of them, because some of the Kent constabulary has been decanted to the other side to try to stop people from coming here. And looking at the camps, looking at how people were getting through, and the appalling conditions in which some were being detained. They had something called the doghouse, which was built of concrete, and they were keeping people inside this very small building for 72 hours. When I came back, the prison ombudsman and I gave a series of submissions to House of Lords and House of Commons committees because we were both so angered by it and concerned.
What is the body you were on that oversaw immigration? What was it called?
It was called, well, the immigration itself changed its name. We didn't. We were the Complaints Audit Committee, but they started off as being the Immigration Directorate of the Home Office, and by the end they were UKBA, but they had another.
And how does a complaint come? I mean, an ordinary member of the public would make a complaint direct to your committee? Or?
No, there are means at the different offices or different detention centres that you can make a complaint.
So anybody dealt with by the immigration system can find a way to make
yeah, and hopefully it's easy. It's supposed to be easy. We designed some systems which were easy.
Interesting. Interesting. Oh, that's very interesting indeed, because I think there are cases that need to be brought forward that I know of. So thank you for pointing that out to me. Having said that, I mean, immigration is a major problem, and it's largely perhaps because it's so hodgepodge here. We have people, I mean, we have a very mixed immigration policy. We've taken almost zero Syrian refugees. When I say almost zero, I mean perhaps 100, or it's of
tiny.
that order. It's comparatively tiny. Whereas we take large numbers of economic migrants who claim asylum, and so.
But hang on, but what happens is they claim asylum in order to prove that you should have residence on the basis of asylum. As you know, you have to be able to prove that you would be at risk of death in your home country. There is, and this is part of the failure of immigration, people get lost in the system. When we took over, it was right after the May 2005 election when Jeremy Paxman had said to the Prime Minister, 9 times, Prime Minister, how many failed asylum seekers are there in the country? And Tony Blair hadn't been able to answer. It took us 2.5 months, and we found out how many. There were 485,000.
Good Lord.
It was not difficult.
Failed
we just had to
asylum
look
seekers that had remained.
They had applied for asylum, and they were still in the country. The files hadn't been processed, and they had got lost.
That's nearly 500,000. It's an interesting situation, but yes, do you believe? I mean, putting you on the spot, do you believe in a world without frontiers, or do you believe that we should have a? I mean, our policy with regard to people who are in despair from countries like Syria, should we have an open door policy? Some countries do. Sweden, for instance, lets every Syrian refugee who applies come to Sweden. Getting there is a different question, but do you believe that is a better way?
Well, we're different from the Swedes in that we had an empire. And until 1986, everyone who lived in all the bits of the world which were pink had a permanent right to live here and work. And it was only with the British Nationalities Act that there were restrictions put on that. But we still have many, hundreds of thousands from former Commonwealth countries who come here, and they have a right to remain. So it's not comparing like with like.
Okay, fair enough. We had one last issue we were going to talk about, and maybe it's an important uplifting note, for final note, and I know when we come to the book review we'll be touching it again, but forgiveness. What about forgiveness? There is a thing called the Forgiveness Project. Which you've taken a personal interest in. What do you mean by this? I mean, when we're talking about...
Let me tell you where I'm beginning. And it's that, how has society become unglued? How have we become so self-autonomous? And how has the sense that we're all involved in this corporate enterprise together, how has that ended? There was, in the middle of the 19th century, when people were looking at what civilization meant and how you could make some countries civilized, and this was certainly happening in the Indian Empire, the progress was to move from a society in which everyone had all of his relationships identified through family or caste or something that was immutable. And certainly the Middle East has had its experience of just this kind of identity through relationships, which means that you can't have a free relationship on all manner of things. Well, we didn't get to the point in British society where we all began to make decisions for ourselves until the 1980s. And we became totally atomized at that point. You could see where the philosophers had been wanting us to get there, but what they hadn't, Adam Smith said that by the time you reached this point, there would be the beneficent hand of Providence, which would make sure that all individuals would be working in harmony. We haven't had the beneficent hand of Providence, and Jeremy Bentham, who started from a different angle, but said that people would make decisions on the basis of the greatest good for the greatest number. That hasn't happened either. And what we've seen is the repercussions of the atomized society with a loss of sense of responsibility to each other. And one evidence of it, which I find quite concerning, is the young, and not just the young, walking along with something in their ears, looking on their phones, not watching where they're going, and living completely sealed off from everybody else.
So when you say the atomized society, you mean basically that people have become selfish, self-centered.
Self-centered.
Their needs are paramount, and they're not thinking selflessly of the other.
People, yeah.
And you feel that, I mean, you put a year on it. You said 1982, did you? But you said that
it was in the 80s.
We became...
We reached that point.
We reached a sort of tipping point
We
where
did.
much of society was, was materialistic and self-centered.
And lost a sense of commitment to each other.
I wouldn't disagree. I think there is a major problem. Part of that surely is to do with the pressures on society, because now employment is more vulnerable, and so on. People are more vulnerable. We even have things called 0 hours contracts.
We have lots of them, indeed.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, so people don't have necessarily the long-term job security and so on that they used to have.
There are good reasons for it.
Yes.
But I think one of the unpleasant sides of this disposition is that we look at other people as being other. And I think the litmus test is psychopaths, failed asylum seekers, and sex offenders. We have absolutely no tolerance for these people at all. We demonize them. We now have television programs which titillate and demonize them.
Yes, it's true.
But if you're actually working with them and trying to rehabilitate them, it becomes extremely difficult in a society which will not have any truck with them at all.
Psychopaths, failed asylum seekers, and sex offenders.
All of which
We are
been on my
intolerant of.
high. Yeah, we are, but these are all people for whom I've tried
Yes.
to improve both the way they have been treated in custody and on release, and it's been jolly hard.
Interesting. I mean, they are regarded in Britain as social pariahs, aren't they? And perhaps understandably up to a point. A psychopath has no sense of responsibility, presumably, for anything they do. A failed asylum seeker is somebody that is regarded as a parasite on society. And a sex offender is a sex offender, and even in our criminal justice system, they are generally almost automatically made Rule 43 prisoners put in solitary confinement
For their own protection.
For their own protection, because.
But what I would say to you is, I think that any society is only as good as it looks after the people whom people in that society least want looked after.
So you believe we should
I think it's
forgive?
a test. I think it's a test. I think we have to do is to become more tolerant of the fact that people can change, and if they're being supported in changing, I think it is it's.
So we should let them be part of the criminal justice system. They should pay their price for their crimes.
Absolutely.
If they've committed them, but we shouldn't hate them, is basically what
Well,
you're saying.
I'll give you an example, sex offenders. It's become very difficult to settle sex offenders in the community.
Yes, of course.
Because we have a law, one like it started in the United States, that anyone who lives around an area, say a hostel where sex offenders might go, they all have to be alerted. On that basis, people are objecting to having a sex offender in a hostel.
Yes.
And if you cannot accommodate them this way and support them, then they go underground and they commit even more offenses. So it's a vicious cycle.
Interesting. Yes, I know that. I can imagine some of our listeners saying, well, they should never be let out of prison in the first place, which is what many people in down the pub in Britain would say. I mean, there is a great intolerance for people who have committed grave offences.
There is. Within criminal justice, we have something called a whole life tariff, which means you will not get parole in any circumstances. You won't be let out. It's a very, very small group, and it's populated by people who have killed multiple times, killed children. If there's some sex offending in there, fine, but it's basically multiple.
So basically what we're saying is that we need a little more forgiveness, and in the world writ large, of course, in a world where we have civil war, violence, you would actually believe in the kind of truth and reconciliation process which involves a public process of forgiveness and certainly admission of guilt, but a process of forgiveness as an alternative to endless retribution. I mean, it is.
Let me tell you about something that I got involved in and I'm going to write up. It isn't restorative justice. It works differently, but it's not a million miles from restorative justice. A dear friend in the Bahamas had started it. And it is perpetrators and victims of all different kinds of offenses sitting for 2 hours once a week in a circle. And they don't have to say anything. Some of them apparently, I've gone to several of the sessions, don't say anything for months. When I was there was a young woman who came in and explained that she had been sexually abused from the age of 4 to 12. And they're perpetrators as well. And the understanding that was coming out of these stories, these encounters, the sense of acceptance that was being generated was one of the most moving things I have ever seen and participated in. And the aim is to move people from hearing each other, accepting each other, and then actually towards loving each other and being generous towards each other and to the community. There's an Oxford project going on now substantiating what its findings are in terms of moving people not just out of criminal justice, but also signs of healthier mental health signposts, that they're doing well in terms of mental health. I think it's extremely exciting, and I think it's a model that could be pursued.
Oh,
here.
wonderful. We need a more forgiving society. So, Anne, bless you. We always discuss a book at this point. It's our custom. And you've brought a particular book to our attention, The Forgiveness Project, by Maria Cantuccino. Or
Yes.
Cantuccino?
Cantaluccino.
Cantaluccino. Now, The Forgiveness Project is a book about a project.
It is indeed.
And it's basically, it is an NGO in itself, isn't it? Or no?
Oh, it's a charity.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
So, and this charity has been at the cutting edge of work on forgiveness. Can you give us an example?
Yes, it's interesting because it isn't, what they're trying to do is to say the vocabulary of forgiveness has been very, very heavily weighted towards religion. That flows as part of most world religions.
Yes.
And they have not dismissed it, but they've said there has to be a secular expression of forgiveness as well, and that by the nature of today's society, that is bound to be a much broader one. And the book has vignettes, has stories
Yes.
of about 1,000 words of people who have been in positions in which they have forgiven. There was one, the first in the book actually was in the papers a few weeks ago, a Jewish woman who had been in Ravensbrück, the last Gestapo
concentration
camp, indeed, but the oldest man likely ever to come to trial again in Germany was there. She attended as a witness, and at the end she went up to him to have a word with him, and he's quite old and frail. She's not young, but less frail than he. And she bent over and he put up his hand like this, and they ended up embracing each other. This was a remarkable personal encounter and personal expression
Of forgiveness.
of forgiveness, exactly.
And give us another example while you're
One that I'm more accustomed to dealing with and knowing about, the parents of a young girl who had been murdered, and they meeting the man who'd perpetrated the crime and forgiving him. And it was compelling. It's forgiveness as a form of love, of a potent variety.
Wonderful. There is this thought that you can forgive the person, you can't forgive the crime. So
Oh, that's different. There are forgiving the crime. This is what's impressive about this.
Right.
There's an acceptance that the person has done something terrible. And I've worked with offenders for many years. There is something very important, I think, that in that intimate exchange, there has to be a measure of acceptance, because it doesn't work otherwise.
Yes. Yes.
I've interviewed terrorists, murderers, drug addicts, the whole lot. And the only way actually of engaging, and it just mercifully comes naturally, maybe this because I'm an American, is to be quiet and non-judgmental. And in that aura of acceptance, the person can all of a sudden be free to share intimate things with you. And there's something healing in that relationship, which I've experienced. And I think that's part of what informs the kinds of transactions that the Forgiveness Project
Yeah.
is promoting.
Interesting. And I do think that you hit a nail. That word non-judgmental. I mean, a lot of people are very cynical about that, but in essence, to be forgiving, that's what it involves, not judging.
Yes, it's acceptance. And if you have that kind of encounter with acceptance, you're actually enabling the offender to be able to accept himself. And there's going to be no change of any offender unless he can accept himself and then accept what he's done and then accept that there's something he has to do about it. But that the whole ground of change, of rehabilitation, the whole ground of change is based in acceptance and non-judgmental.
So the Forgiveness Project by Maria, and we're going to get her name right, the surname Cantuccia.
Forgive me.
It's all right.
Cantuccino.
Maria Cantuccino. Okay, The Forgiveness Project by Maria Cantuccino. A book we'll all look at with interest.
Good.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you
Thank
very
you
much
very
for being
much.
our guest
Thank
on
you.
ANN Television.
It's been a great pleasure.
Bless you.